Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hebron Chinese Alliance Church, our Wednesday devotions. I hope you're doing okay and that your week is doing pretty good. We're continuing our series looking at the 10 commandments that we kicked off a couple of weeks ago, and today we're looking at commandment number 2, and you'll find that in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verse 4, 5, and 6. We're looking at the second commandment, Exodus chapter 20. 4, 5, and 6. So if you've got a Bible, jump there as I begin to read. Exodus 20, verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. One of my hobbies is collecting pictures of Jesus. I've got a hard drive chock full of them, images that I've found from around the world depicting who he is and what he's done. So I've got pictures of Jesus portrayed as a socialist, as a revolutionary, as a refugee, as a freedom fighter, carrying a rifle, carrying a lamb over his shoulder. I've got images of Jesus where he's portrayed as in the French countryside, as Japanese, as Puerto Rican, as African, as American, as Australian. I've got images of Jesus portrayed in medieval times, during the Renaissance, and as if he would be living today. I'm truly fascinated by how people portray him, who he is and what he's done. And so if you ever come across a picture of Jesus, a cultural representation of who he is, please email it to me. Now, the question is, are those artists, they're being creative, but are they breaking commandment number 2? You shall not make for yourself an image. As creative as they are they breaking that commandment? Because the theory goes, well, if Jesus is God, if Jesus is the image of God, and the commandment says, well, don't bow down to any images, well, then it seems that an image of Jesus would break the second commandment. And I guess the same would apply to statues and icons. I grew up surrounded by icons at home, at church. I had one hanging from the rearview mirror of my car. Was my mum breaking the second commandment? Was I being surrounded by these images? For us at Hebron Chinese Alliance Church, we don't have any images like this or statues or icons. And you yourself may have never come across one. You in your home or at your school, you go, no, that stuff's only for certain religious people. It's got nothing to do with me. And so if that's you, it's tempting to think, well, the second commandment, cool, sweet, done. It's not applicable. Let's just move on to number 3. But the second commandment is important for 3 reasons for us. Firstly, it tells us that God is a jealous God, that God is a monogamous God, and that worshipping an image is akin to a spouse who commits adultery. And so the second commandment is a call to faithfulness. That's ultimately what it's doing. It's a call to faithfulness. Second reason why the commandment is important for us is that it's a commandment with a warning and an encouragement. It's the only commandment that has both. It's got a curse and a blessing. And so we would want to avoid the former to receive the latter. So that's why this commandment is important, so that we may receive blessing. And thirdly, this commandment is a call to worship. A call to worship God as God intended, not as we believe it should be, but it is on God's terms. And so we worship God as God has dictated. And that is ultimately by faith, not sight. And so whilst you and I, we may not have statues or icons at home, at church, hanging from your rearview mirror, the second commandment is still really important for us because of those 3 reasons, because it's a call to faithfulness, to receive blessing, and to worship God as God intended, to worship God rightly. So faithfulness, blessing, and to worship by faith, not sight. They're the 3 great reasons why this commandment is important to us as we follow Jesus today. Now, just to be clear, this commandment is not a prohibition against all images, against art. If that was the case, well, then the first sentence of this commandment, well, it means there'll be no images of everything, of anything, Don't make an image of anything in heaven or on earth. Well, that would cancel everything out. But it's not saying that. One of the reasons why it's not saying is that, well, God himself says to Moses, I would like you to fashion cherubs on the ark. And so cherubs are heavenly beings and they sit on top of the ark. So God's calling Moses to make an image of these heavenly beings. Not only that, there's a story where God's people, they all get bitten by snakes, and for them to be healed, God says to Moses, create a bronze serpent, and the people who look to it, well, they will live. And so it's not a prohibition against creating images of things on heaven or on earth. What it's doing is imposing a prohibition against images intended for worship. It's a prohibition against turning God into a thing, and so that people would bow down and say, hey, this is your God. And so that is why many years later, Hezekiah found the bronze serpent and smashed it to pieces, because this thing had become the thing that they would worship. It had become an object of worship. And not long after the Ten Commandments, Aaron fashions a golden calf. Gets everybody's jewelry, melts it down, turns it into this golden calf and says, this is your God. This is whom we should bow down and worship to. This is the God who brought you out of Egypt from slavery. That is what causes Moses to get angry. He comes down the mountain. He's holding the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. He's so angry, he throws them aside. They get smashed, and then he smashes the golden calf. It too had become an object of worship. And so God isn't prohibiting images. God isn't prohibiting art. Rather, it's the making of an image for the purpose of worshiping God, the God of the universe, reducing him into this thing made of stone or wood or anything else, and saying, this thing is our God. And what God is doing here in Exodus, he's just brought his people up out of Egypt, is that he's drawing a distinction between them and the people around them. You see, when God's people were in Egypt, they would have seen their gods emblazoned everywhere, on statues in stone, on walls in hieroglyphics. But here they are on the verge of entering the promised land, and God calls them to worship by faith, not sight. God's calling them to faithfulness in him. God's saying, you want to receive blessing? Worship by faith, not sight. And this is something that God's people really do, so much so that when the Queen of Sheba arrives to visit Jerusalem, she is amazed. She is blown away by what she sees. She doesn't see any icons, any statues, any idols, any things representing God. What she sees is their faith. She can see that God dwells here, that God dwells amongst God's people. She doesn't see idols or images. She sees faith. And so, in a sense, Israel's lack of images was, in a sense, evangelistic. He brought the Queen of Sheba in, and she saw their faith. But the thing about people is that we're visual people. God has given us the sense of sight, and there's something deep within us that just needs to see. We need an image to see, to hold on to. An image helps us fashion the world in our image. It gives us something to grasp and to hold on to bring some logic and coherency. In the end, we can point to this thing, this icon, this statue, and say, this is my God. And I admit, for years, I had an icon of Mary and the baby Jesus hanging above my bed, well into my adulthood. It wasn't something just for me as a kid. And I could just look at that thing and say, that is my God. It provides me comfort. Maybe I can turn to it. I can look to it. I can bow down to it. This thing helps me to see. And that's just the result of our humanness. That's a result of our fallenness. That's a result of our fear, our uncertainty, that if we can't see something or can't touch something, we kind of feel a bit lost. And that's the challenge of faith, because faith compels us to accept that which we can't see. trusting in the one who is unseen. And and the good news is that we can have confidence as we trust in the one who is unseen. And the reason why is because God sent Jesus, and Jesus is the image of God. We have this perfect representation of who God is. Jesus isn't a bit like God. Jesus is not impersonating God, and God's the real thing. No, Jesus is also the real thing. God sent his son, his image into this world, his icon, so to speak. And therefore, that gives our faith confidence. We can walk by faith because of who Jesus is and what he has done. And what did Jesus say to the Samaritan woman? I want you to worship in spirit and in truth. And so again, Jesus is echoing this second commandment. We are to worship in spirit, not via this thing. And again, worship is set on God's terms, not ours. It's not how we fashion God. We set the agenda. We set the limits. This thing. No, God says, I set the agenda, and I want you to worship me in spirit and in truth. And so all those pictures of Jesus that I have, they're not wrong. They're most likely inaccurate. I've got many pictures of Jesus, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, and I'm pretty sure Jesus looked more like me than some surfer on Palm Beach. And so whilst those images may be a bit dicey, a bit strange, our faith can be confident because of who he is, because he is the image of God. And as Jesus himself said to Thomas, after he'd been raised, blessed are you for you see, but blessed are those who have not seen yet have believed. And that's you and I. We walk by faith. We haven't seen Jesus, and he says, that's okay. You are blessed for believing, even though you haven't seen. Again, echoing that second commandment, receiving God's blessing, because we see with eyes of faith. And again, in a world where that we may be troubled by all that we see, our confidence comes in what God has revealed in Jesus and ultimately in his word. God, we can't see God, but God can be heard. God is unseen, but God speaks to us through his word. And therefore, it's God's word that ought to shape our worship. Jesus described the word made flesh. He is the one who ought to direct our worship. And so that's why we obey his commands. That's why we do the things that he says. That is why we imitate and mimic him. We do the things that he says. We walk by faith, trusting that they are true, that he is setting the agenda for how we worship him. And so there are hundreds, if not thousands, of images of Jesus, and they offer a snapshot, a cultural glimpse into who he is and what he's done. But ultimately, that is not found in what he's saying, in what we can handle and touch, but what is revealed in the scriptures. And so let us seek to be faithful. Let us seek to be blessed, and let us worship by faith, not sight. Let's be faithful. Let's seek God's blessing. And let's walk by faith, not sight. I'm going to pray. Dear God, thank you for revealing yourself in your son, Jesus, so that we don't have to guess, but we can know who you are and what you are like and what you have done for us. So help us to avoid the temptation to reduce you to a thing. It's a fish sticker. It's the Lord's Supper painting. It's footprints. It's an image of Jesus. It's a cross hanging from our neck. As humans, we grasp onto these things because the world can be so uncertain, and even our faith can seem small. Help us to live by faith. Help us to worship you by faith, not sight. Help us to trust you as you set the agenda for how we worship you. Thank you for your word. Help us to hold on to it. Help us to be like your people when the Queen of Sheba turns up and she sees faith. She sees you alive and well and dwelling amongst your people. Dear God, I pray that that would be real for us, that people would see faith alive and well in us. That they wouldn't see, religious paraphernalia, but that they would see Jesus as we seek to obey, as we seek to live out, as we seek to follow him. And so, dear God, help us to be faithful. Thank you for blessing us through Jesus. and help us to walk by faith, not sight. Amen. Thanks, guys. I hope you continue to walk by faith this week, that you may worship God by faith. Our Sunday service / live stream is coming up 10 a.m. and we're going to be having some people in the building, so it'd be great to see some familiar and friendly faces. If you can't be there in person, it'd be great to tune in at 10 a.m. Take care. Have a good week. Walk by faith.